So what we're going to be talking about today is we're getting started on another technique. So last week we did toned paper, and we're going back to toned paper, I think again next week. But I want to start sliding in another drawing technique because over the course of the summer, we'll start kind of combining all of these things together. And today we're going to start talking about academic drawing. Now, I've touched on this a little bit in previous summers, talking about drawing from plaster casts, and we did a little bit of that, I think, last year. Um, Today, we're going to actually be using it to draw other subject matter. So this is a class where I said we're going to have a figurative subject, and we are in a sense, but we're going to just be drawing a very small portion of the reference material. And that's basically because of the length of time it takes to do academic drawing. It is a wonderful and very soothing sort of technique. It also takes quite a bit of time to do. So we're going to be doing kind of an overview of how it all works, drawing this particular part of an image, and then that'll set us up so the next time we're using this technique, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let's get started. Okay, everybody. Welcome back to another summer of drawing. And this is class number 5 on the theme of home. And today we're going to be drawing some dusty boots. So let me explain what that has to do with the theme of home. So for a number of years, Bill and I worked on a small island close to Martha's Vineyard, and we were working as caretakers, but we were also looking after a large herd of Highland cattle and a farm. And it was an interesting experience. So we were there for about 7 years, and it certainly impacted how we live our lives today. And I have some really good memories of those times, and including some time spent on a tractor. Our boots, I didn't have fancy boots like these. My boots were more like Wellington boots, rubber boots. But when I saw this particular image, I thought, to me, this was part of being of that home I had for 7 years of this kind of farm life with the chickens and the cows and everything that went along with growing a garden, all the rest of it, and also using farm equipment and tractors and such. And there's something about the satisfaction of doing that kind of labor, of getting sort of hot, sweaty, and dirty, but having, done something amazing, with the land and sort of, especially when you're looking after something like a herd of cattle, of managing the welfare of animals on a large scale like that. So all of that led me to say, well, that really is part of my sort of interpretation of the theme of home. So when it comes to, so you're probably going, okay, the figurative part is obviously a shoe or a foot. And I'm pretty keen when it comes to figure drawing to not just concentrate on anatomy and the nude body, because lots and lots and lots and lots of people are doing it. You go into a museum and there are nudes everywhere. People have been for hundreds of years painting the nude body. There are lots and lots of books on figure drawing, and particularly on academic drawing, what we're going to be talking about today, that concern the nude body. But my feeling is, as I go through my everyday, I just don't see that many nude bodies, not in the Stop and Shop, not at Morning Glory Farm, not walking down the road. And it's really, if I'm going to draw my life and things in my life, most of the people passing through have clothes on. And learning how to draw that and how to draw clothes and such, I think is important. The folds, the textures, and all of that sort of thing. So we were talking over the last couple of weeks of different ways of drawing. And like last summer, we did a lot of sketching where you rely on the pencil pressure to make lights and darks. For the last few classes, we've been talking a lot about using a beveled pencil and varied values of actual pencil leads, to help us get, different shading. Then we talked about a little bit about how to use those pencil strokes to get texture by using the strokes themselves. Academic drawing is a different way to achieve some of these same things. And I'll show you in a minute how that works. What I also like is the abstract arrangement of values. If you squint at this and sort of look at the light and dark patterns, there's an interesting abstraction going on there. So academic drawing really applies to kind of a style of drawing that harkens back to the ateliers of hundreds of years ago, where if you were going to learn at an academy, how to be a painter, you would go through all of these steps, sometimes taking years before you got to the point of actually painting. And the way you would start off is by doing copies of other drawings. You would be doing drawing and painting from plaster casts, monochromatic, so you learned your values. Eventually, you'd be doing the same thing with a live model, and then finally, you'd get to use some color. And these days, we have a tendency to jump to the color right away, and I think it creates a bit of a problem because we don't really understand how to use the values, how to manipulate the values of what we're seeing, the lights and the darks. So right here, this is one way that people would go about doing their drawings in an atelier at an academic drawing class, and that would be doing what is called the site size method of drawing and painting. And that's where you've got your paper or your canvas set up in such a way that whatever it is you're drawing or painting, you're reproducing at the same size over here on your canvas or on your paper. If you're reproducing a plate, for example, you would have the plate right beside you, perhaps also up on an easel, and your paper right beside it. And you'd be trying to make it as an exact of a reproduction as possible. And this was, to begin with, it's easier not to have to like minimize or maximize an image and translate that onto paper. You've eliminated the need to do that. And all you're doing is worrying about, making accuracy of form, accuracy of shading, and all of that sort of thing. The other reason is that many artists paint like this all the time, that when they set up their easel to paint a portrait or whatever, they move the easel or the person to the point where the whatever it is that they are painting is the same size as it is on the canvas. Just makes it so much easier to check measurements and that kind of thing. So if you were starting off at an atelier, one of the first things that you would be doing is you'd be given some sort of drawing to copy, or in this particular case, there was a French artist who developed an entire course of drawing with all of these drawing plates. And that kind of became a standard for how to go about really drawing all the different parts of the body from different viewpoints. So this is one of those plates. It's of a foot, obviously. And this is a typical sort of atelier approach, where before you even started drawing from the plaster cast or drawing from the model, that you would go through a whole series, perhaps trying to copy every single one of the drawings in the series. And I think there were over 100 of them. I'm not sure exactly how many plates there were total. This is something actually that Van Gogh tried to do a number of times. He was very keen on the idea of getting his drawing skills better, and he kept going back to these series of plates and trying to duplicate them, hoping to improve his own drawing skills. So what you're seeing here is on the left-hand side the completed drawing, and on the right-hand side how you would get started. And you would get started by figuring out what the overall shape was that you wanted to draw, then getting a little bit more detailed with the lines, making the interior contour lines a little bit more accurate, and then going ahead and very carefully shading. But while you did that, also making the lines that you had drawn before more accurate. So there's a lot of erasing that goes on while you're doing academic drawing, because every line that you saw and that you marked out as part of your contour might have just been an indication or a note that you made to yourself about where you were going, or it could have been a very simplified form. And when you get to the actual one, and you can see it here, like for example in the toes, those lines that were originally drawn on the right are simplified. So somebody going through the process of copying these first would try to copy the actual the lines, the contour lines, the very basic lines, and copy that first. And then they would copy the shading, trying to make the adjustments as they go in order to do that. And here's another example of the back of a foot. And what you'll notice here in particular is not only the form is drawn of the foot, but also indicating where those shaded areas are, kind of giving yourself notes about like where exactly does that shadow line form. And that's really important because you know how it is if you're trying to create that feeling of a rounded form, that shadow has to fall in just the right place to get the right idea of how a heel works, for example, or how an ankle works. And so making those marks as you go is sort of important. So these are really the three steps. You draw the contours of the form, you indicate where the areas change from light to dark or show other shading. At the same time, you're sort of neatening things up. And then you carefully use pencil value and pressure to create very smooth transitions. So here's an example that I had done a couple of years back, just because I felt I likewise needed to brush up on this type of pencil drawing. So this is actually quite large. The head itself is probably about a little bit over a foot high, and so I had on my easel a printed copy of these plates and my paper next to it, and I spent a good deal of time first getting the contour drawing right, and then doing all the inside shading and getting that part right. It took hours, hours and hours. I don't even know how many, but quite a number to achieve the final image. And I'll show you a close up of what that pencil drawing texture looks like. So here on the left is the whole thing, and here on the right, you can see I'm using that Fabriano Artistico paper I like so much that does have a little bit of texture, and how very careful the shading is overall to kind of achieve this particularly, this is sort of a one value of wash in almost the whole thing. But if you look over here on the left, you can see like around the bottom of the chin, around the sides of the eyes, the eyelid, around the neck, that there is some shading involved, and where it goes, you have to pay particularly close attention to, which is why that original drawing where you kind of map out where your shading goes is so important. So this is this is our image today, of which we are only going to try this on a small portion because there's an artist whose book I'll talk to you about later on figure drawing by an artist named Anthony Ryder, and he shows, for example, in his book on figure drawing, where he has gone through this process, and he has often taken 6 hours just to do that initial contour, those initial outlines, to get that just right, so that when he starts the inside drawing, which could take twice as long for him to do all the shading, the results are extraordinary. But I mean, we're talking weeks and weeks. And speaking of weeks and weeks, I haven't forgotten about the robin. I was supposed to have that done for, this week, and you know what? I didn't work on it at all this last week. I mean, I'm lucky that I happen to be a pretty busy professional artist, but this is why academic drawing tends to be done by people, or in fact, drawing in general, or taking drawings beyond sketching, tends to be done by people who are getting pretty serious about drawing, because the whole mindset of drawing that says, hey, it's okay to take 6 hours, 20 hours, or however long it takes, is really not part of our sort of current mindset about art, which tends to be more about how rapidly can we get things done. So I'm really interested in introducing you to the academic drawing approach, because I do want you to be able to slow down and do drawings over time. And if it takes all summer to do something, then that's how long it takes. So if you were to approach doing an entire drawing of something like this, which I think would be a wonderful, wonderful subject for academic drawing. There's interesting stuff going on, interesting forms. You could also crop it down a little bit, but it's also, boots and shoes are something that people usually need a bit more practice on. And so approaching drawing a subject like that in this manner is a really good entry point. So the first thing that you would want to do is to print out, or to have on the screen, or however you'd like to do it, the image that you're working with at whatever size you want to draw it. So this is a really important part of academic drawing. Academic drawing isn't really so much about creativity as it is about getting really solid skills nailed down to really be able to draw. And so the fact that you're doing something at the same size is a perfect way to make that happen. So if you don't want to print out something large, because really you want to draw this on a relatively large scale, at least 16 by 20. If you didn't want to, tile out paper or have someone print it out, you could just print out a section of it as large as possible, and then on your own drawing paper, try to duplicate that in terms of exactly how the proportions look and exactly how the shading looks. Because it is, to begin with, it's kind of a Zen-like drawing experience, but it will also teach you to observe at a level of detail that we usually don't do. Everything we have been doing up till now has been very much on a matter of sort of simplifying, simplifying what we're seeing, simplifying the form, trying to figure out how to do a few things in order to make them look like more things. And academic drawing is almost the opposite. You're trying to actually do every little bit. So site size, working from the same size as your reference. The block in is that business where you just put down the main lines, the very, very basic ones. At that point, you actually want to hold the pencil away from your lead, as I was showing you last summer. And then, interestingly, when you get to the contour part, which is when you refine all those lines and make them more accurate, you actually want to hold the pencil more like you do for regular writing, because you have a little bit more control in there at that point. And squinting will help you determine where those areas of light and shade are, so that if you need to give yourself some hints, you can. And then the last stage is what's called drawing on the inside, which is when you use hatching and a kind of a continuous motion of pencil drawing, varying the pressure as you need, and constantly observing the subject matter, holding the pencil away from the lead again, because you want to get that lightness of touch when you need it. And you kind of complete the entire drawing that way. And sometimes you go over it multiple times to get the right values, the right darkness. Sometimes you have to come and erase a bit because you made it too dark or whatever. And it can be useful to do what is called window shading, which is starting at the top or the upper left-hand corner, if you're right-handed, of the page, and sort of working your way all across the drawing once, and then coming back and seeing if anything has to be refined. So the way we're going to do this today is that we are going to, so this is the little segment that we're going to be drawing. We're not going to worry about drawing the entirety of this. What I do want to do is lead you through every single one of these steps, so you understand exactly how it goes. And we're going to start off just by talking about the tools we need to do this. So over the last few classes, we've done the thing with the blunt pencil end, which is really useful. But for this, for academic drawing, you actually want a pretty good point on your pencils. And the reason why you often see people carving back the wood from the lead, just like we did for the beveled pencil, is because you can actually go a lot longer without having to continually sharpen your pencil. But also, you end up making, it's not really a bevel, but it's sort of an elongated point while you draw that does allow you to actually put down washes of graphite in a similar manner to the way that we did it with the beveled pencil. And it's something that you'll just sort of develop as you go along. All of a sudden, you'll realize that is happening. So you're not working with the tip of the pencil, up at a 90-degree angle. You're not using the point for that, but you are using it so that you can get into details and get into small areas if you need to while you're doing this kind of drawing. Another thing I find that's really useful is any kind of pencil holder that has a lead in it. That's another way to be able to, to have a lead that you're not constantly sharpening your pencil. But either way is fine. I also find that for academic drawing, starting off with something like just a regular HB or a 2B, nothing really, nothing too hard, is a good way to get the first layers down. So when I talked last week, I said we would be doing smudging and blending and stuff in upcoming classes. The reason I am not starting you with that, and that we're doing all of these other methods instead, the beveled end and now this, is to get that control. Because blending and smudging using tools is one way to achieve kind of an overall, wash of graphite. But to be able to do it with the actual pencil, it takes a little time to work this skill up, but it's really worth it. So the first thing that we're going to do just for a few minutes to kind of get you warmed up is to deal with what is this technique of how do I actually make it work? And there are two main ways that people do academic drawing. You're holding the pencil away from the lead to begin with, as far back as you want to keep a light touch. And then you're either hatching and cross-hatching, varying the directions, which is what you see in A, B, and C. Basically, in A, if you want to just draw along while I'm talking about this, I'm just sort of doing this back and forth. It's not like hatching like we do for pen and ink, where you take your hand off at the end of every stroke. You're actually leaving the pencil tip on the page, and you're just sort of going back and forth. In this case, I was leaving a little bit of space between the lines. And then when I got to B, I was trying to do something more like what we were doing with the beveled pencil edge, which is bringing those lines closer together and creating more of a graphite wash. And then for C, what I'd like you to try is just doing that in different directions. You can see I've done one direction, then the second time I did a different direction, the third time I did another direction. And this is so that you can build up that kind of consistent value, that consistent wash of whatever value it is that you want. But also when you're doing a form that is rounded, like a person or boots or whatever it happens to be, you can actually have your pencil strokes following the direction of the form so that your hatching, for example, if you did, just maybe a couple of different directions of hatching, starts to follow the folds, for example, of the boots. The second way of dealing with of doing academic drawing is kind of a looser version of the first one, and this is where you actually make kind of these oval circles. So it's really sort of the same thing as the hatching. You're making these circles; they're continuous. And so in D, I just showed you kind of big how they look. That's not really how I do it. I don't do it that loosely. What I do is more like what is in E, where you're overlapping your ovals, doing this continuous motion until you're sort of almost coloring it in. But what you want to try to do, and this is why people often start with the hatching instead of the circular motion, is you're trying not to go over the same place over and over again. You're trying to continue expanding the area that you're drawing in. Now, while you're doing this, and this is what F is about, so while you're doing that same sort of circular technique, you can apply a little bit more pressure to start making it darker. But you'll find, just like we did with the other techniques that we did using the value of a pencil, you get to the point where an HB pencil definitely does sort of max out. So what you want instead is to be able to blend in other pencil softness. So you can see here that I started with a 2B, I did it kind of light, and then I beefed it up a little bit as I continued my ovals till I got to the point I couldn't get any darker. And then I came back with the 4B and I darkened things up. Now, how exactly you move the pencil is going to be very individually up to you. There isn't just one way to hatch. There isn't just one way to do these ovals. But the end result that you're after, no matter how you do it, is to have a very smooth, even value of whatever, light, dark, medium, whatever it is that you're working with, without lots of paper showing through and without lots of little dark areas. Now, when you get started on this, you'll have lots of both, easy enough to fill in the areas where there's paper, right? The darker areas, you have to sort of assess, can I just smooth this out by smoothing out the area around the edge of the dark place, and then, then I've got an even tone? Or was that dark spot actually too dark? And if it was, you can just lift it up a little bit with your kneaded rubber eraser to kind of get the tone back. What you want to do, though, is you want to be careful not to smear or smudge the graphite, because that will give it a different kind of color. It's sort of hard to describe, but you'll if you do it, you'll see what I mean. What you're looking for is all the value and all the tone to be created just by the pencil tip. So in general, especially when you're just getting started with academic drawing, you'll be doing almost everything with like a HB, 2B, and 4B for only the darkest part, so that you can kind of modulate your tone and modulate your stroke. That's really the most important part of this. So wrap up this little bit of warm up, and we'll go ahead and get started on the next step. All right, so as I mentioned, the very first thing that we're going to do, and of course you can't do it that way today, but to the greatest extent, you do want to work in a site-sized method as you do this week on your own, from either a printout, or if you're doing something live, you can, because of course you can draw, your coffee cup or whatever, holding your sketchbook up so that it's sort of in the same parallel as whatever it is you're drawing. Often you'll see that artists who are drawing in the academic method actually do this using an easel and the easel is 90 degrees to the ground. It's not leaning because that would cause your artwork to be distorted a little bit. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get that accuracy of the side by side. So whether you're working on an easel or whether you're drawing from life, in which case you still want your drawing board upright, or whether you have printed out your reference and you can at that point have it, wherever you want, I would still recommend having your drawing board sort of up further perhaps than you normally draw, because that way you can take a step back. That's one of the things that's useful about using an easel. Take a step back and look for those value changes. So we're going to get started with the very first step that you would want to do, and that is the block in. Now, when you do the block in, you are just looking for the basic lines, the basic overall form of whatever it is you're drawing. In this particular case, and I'm going to give you, about 7 minutes at this particular stage to really, really look carefully at this. You're not worrying so much about the shadows at this point, and where the shading falls or anything like that. Although in this case, I have marked out, as you can see, there's a little bit of shadow on the green over on the right-hand side, and I have kind of marked where I think it is. I'm reasonably accurate, but not very accurate at this point. And I haven't rounded out a lot of forms or anything of that nature because I know all of that is going to get corrected in the next step. What's more important is that I'm starting to actually look at, observe this reference and kind of figure out as I go along, how is this going to work? Where are the dark areas? What's sort of the whole gesture of the thing? The person's got their foot on the pedal there. I'm going to have to make sure my angle of how the boot comes down, kind of get that right. And so for your block in, you're trying to get that overall feeling of what's going on. Now, if I were drawing a human and say it was like a nude model in a live drawing class or something like that, I would be looking at the general, maybe triangular shape that the person takes if they're, sitting on the dais with holding their knees or something like that. There's an overall form there that I'd be looking for. In this particular case, because we've got this photo reference, we can kind of get in there to the details a little bit more easily. But as you go along and as you get used to doing a little bit more of this type of drawing, you'll be assessing the shapes that you see in terms of light and dark and determining, as you draw them, is this going to be something that you want to include in the drawing or not include in the drawing? So I think when people do a lot of this kind of drawing, there's a tendency to want to put in everything that you actually see in your reference material. And we have today, as you know, we've skipped the no-tan stage and we've even skipped a rough sketch, because we really don't need a rough sketch per se. But if you did have some reference material that had a lot of lights and darks, and you could still go ahead and do a no-tan. What I decided to do instead with this little snippet of the artwork or the reference material, is when I squinted at it, I could see very clearly that the area under the foot and the shadow areas were pretty well defined. As I drew, if I were going to do this as a large drawing, I might decide, actually I want to modulate my pencil and pick up some of that interesting, that kind of waffle metal work that's under his foot and or under her foot. I don't know whose foot it is. And I might want to add some interesting stuff into those darks. But when I did, I would still want the overall impression of that area to be a darker value rather than a lighter value. So I'll just let you draw for a little bit longer. And I'm actually going to read a couple of excerpts to you from The Artist's Complete Guide to Figure Drawing by Anthony Ryder, the fellow I was talking about before. Because when I first started drawing, I wasn't really sure, like what was a good technique. I haven't been to art school and didn't know that sort of thing. And I picked up books as I tend to. And a copy of this might be at the Vineyard Haven Public Library, I'm not sure. But this particular book, if you do ever look at it, you'll see that a lot of the things that he is saying is what I am saying. I just tend to apply this type of drawing to a lot more than figure drawing. I do a lot of my regular drawing using this particular method as well, because it works perfectly. So let me find these excerpts that I noticed. I liked this particular excerpt from his introduction where he says, because I like to paint, but I find drawing to be really important to that process. And he says, in painting, everything depends on the drawing. The drawing is the inner structure that upholds and organizes the composition, and anyone who wants to learn to paint must therefore learn to draw. But drawing is more than just an adjunct to the art of painting. It is an art in itself. Whether one pursues it alone or in conjunction with painting, one soon realizes that it occupies a unique aesthetic territory. There is a quality to drawing that is all its own. And I feel that very strongly, that no matter whether you're having hours and hours to draw or whether you really are just sort of at the kind of like me, you've got a busy life, but you enjoy doing some sketching, that in and of itself is just such a wonderful activity and a pastime. And I'm sure why most of you are here. So in this particular case, he's talking about the amount of time that he puts into the drawings. And I just thought this was worth sharing with you. If you find yourself struggling to either find the time or wondering if you're taking too long to do a drawing, he said, on average, I put in about 12 3-hour sessions for each finished figure drawing. And his figure drawings are usually about 18 by 24, and they're very complete. I'll show you one at the end of the class. I work at an even tempo as if I were building a piece of furniture, carefully crafting, shaping, and polishing each part. As you develop a facility with the terms, exercises, and principles in this drawing method, you too will be able to work through this process one step at a time to create beautiful and elaborate drawings. And I think that that's really important as well. I mean, this initial stage I did very quickly. In fact, I did all of these exercises I'm showing you very quickly because I knew that I wanted to emulate the amount of time that you had, and that would be pretty sketchy stuff, even though I'm trying to teach you something that isn't sketchy. But if I were to just sort of sit down because I wanted to start from start to finish and do this, I would want to try to enjoy each stage of this, and have a little bit of fun getting everything just right, before I went on to the next step. In this particular case, if today you're kind of going, this is basically a boot, and some other stuff on the right-hand side, that's just fine too. Okay, we're going to move on to the next stage. So that was the block-in. That's where you start after you have yourself set up with your reference material and such. Okay, so this next part is where you refine all that, and it's called the contour. And you might wonder, well, how come we're not getting right to the shading bit right away? But the shading part and all of that value structure will be so much easier if you get this stage right. So the contour is when you refine those lines, make them more accurate, and you add in the indications of defined areas between the light and the dark. So how you do that is entirely up to you. What I tend to do is I tend to sort of kind of quasi outline some of the darker areas where I know I really need to be able to show that contrast. And then in some of the other areas where perhaps I don't need quite so much of a roadmap, you can see sort of, near the top of the boot, I just put a couple of lines kind of going, oh yeah, I'm going to need to go down here and do something. Now, for this part, you go back to holding your pencil close to the lead. So if you forget to do this as you're going along, the further from the lead, closer, further bit, don't worry. But the reason why it's suggested is just from a control point of view. When you're putting those first lines down for the block in, and you're a little bit looser, and you want to kind of get the gesture of the entire image or whatever it is you're drawing down. In the contour, you're not worried about gesture so much. You kind of already established that. Your angles are pretty good, but they probably need refining. And you actually do want to be pretty accurate because you want, for the last stage, when you're actually doing all of that shading, you want to feel kind of free. You'll still continue to modify things as you go along and, erase little lines that are in the wrong place and, make changes and do that sort of thing. But you're going to want to be able to concentrate on the value changes pretty much only, and really not worry so much about the proportion and the drawing and all of that kind of thing. That bit you really want to have taken care of already. And so this harkens quite a bit to the way that I go about painting. I like to, especially as I get near the end of the painting, I'm starting to get much more freer with my brush strokes and this, that, and the other. As I go along, I start off relatively, I won't say tight as much as trying to be really accurate, trying to get everything in the right place. I find if I start off a painting too loosely, then I'm fighting that the entire time as I'm trying to get some degree of accuracy in. Whereas if I start off with accuracy, then I can lose it anywhere I want to or keep it anywhere I want to, but that bit is done. I don't have to continually try to add it back in again. And I think that's what appeals to me about the academic style of drawing is that it's the same sort of thing. You get the detail and the accuracy done up front, and then that allows you to go forward. Now, one of the reasons that um, I don't do a ton of the academic drawing myself or teach that method a lot is because there are now so many places that you can, whether it's online on video or in books or actually attending an atelier, like there's a number of ateliers in Boston, for example. You can go and have that in-person experience to have that class and go through that very rigorous process. I've mentioned a number of times how we tend to look back to the 30s and 40s and 50s and the decades and centuries before to get our drawing information because of this kind of drawing desert that happened for, a good, 30, 40 years, and we lost a lot of that knowledge. When people started becoming more interested in bringing that kind of drawing, like reaching back over that time period and bringing in the classical drawing and the traditional drawing that had gone way out of favor, really all with impressionism and all sorts of things. Um, I think there was almost a tendency to get too concerned about being just like it was in the 1800s, and even now you'll find people whose rigorous attachment to drawing done the way it was done classically, they produce some beautiful work, but are they saying anything new? I guess is what I mean. Are they saying anything new with this technique, or is it just really beautiful stuff that looks like it was done in the 1800s? And that's not to take away from trying that. It's a lot of fun, and it's really cool to be able to produce something that does look like that. But I think when it comes to an artistic career, after you've tried a bunch of that and had that experience, you can also say, well, this is a technique, and it doesn't have to be applied just to people posing in classical manner or to plaster casts like the one I have over my head, or even just to figure. But you can actually take this particular drawing method and draw anything you want to, including very contemporary subject matter, including people with their clothes on, anything at all. And so that's why I tend to, even though I show you the business about how you can go about academic drawing from plates and such, I would rather you drew an old boot. I would rather you drew a tractor, or something else, using these techniques. And then if you want to also try figure drawing doing this as well, you can. The other drawback, I think, to starting off with the academic drawing right away when it comes to figure drawing is it's difficult. It's so difficult that it really, I think, dissuades a lot of people from just drawing like this. Really, when it comes down to it, how you draw in this method is actually quite simple. It's just a matter of following this process of getting sort of specific up front. Okay, so let's move on to the more fun bit. This is the bit that, I always get to that part, in a drawing where I'm starting to have more fun. And for me, when it comes to academic drawing, it's this. It's when I start drawing on the inside, carefully drawing using either hatching or that circular motion, varying the pressure as you need and constantly observing the subject matter. I suggest holding the pencil a little further away from the lead again, because you're going to want to start off a little bit light till you kind of get your feet. So what I have done in this example is I have not completed it. I wanted you to sort of see how it kind of comes together. And in this particular case, what you'll find, and this is what I think is the fun part, is that you're sort of feeling your way around the subject matter through the end of your pencil. And you just pick a place to start. For me, I started in the upper left-hand corner because that wasn't the boot and the shapes didn't really matter. And I figured, well, this is a good enough place for me to start. Let me just start. I see a kind of a mid-tone, and then it goes down to light, and then it gets darker, so I can put the darker in, and then it comes up on the side of that pipe or whatever it is, and it's a little bit darker. And I kept kind of sort of talking to myself, thinking my way across this little drawing. And it didn't take me any longer to do this than the time I'm giving you, which is going to be about 12 or 13 minutes. But what I did was just, I didn't try to fill in everything as I went, because what will happen as you go is you'll start to hit areas of uncertainty when you're like, wait a minute, okay, if I squint at this, I can see some lights and darks on that leather. How light or how dark does that need to be? And this is when you go back to that business of doing what you see, like what you see that is the easiest, that makes sense, and that right away. And so for me, I'm like, okay, let me head to some of those darker shadows. I tend to, as you know well, I tend to go for the dark areas first anyway. So I have my piece of tracing paper down on top of this so that I don't smudge everything that I'm doing as I go across. But I'm like, let me kind of move into the middle of this drawing and put in some of those darks around the edges of the boot. And while I'm at it, why don't I try to make my boot a little bit more accurate? Now, I wasn't trying to in any way do this drawing as a sight size exercise where I was really being super accurate, like the plates that we saw earlier. So everything about the leather, everything about the heel and the pedal and everything aren't like super accurate to the reference material, but I did want to get them in generally the right place so that I could start getting the right feel of what was going on. So as you work, try to, especially today, if this is the first time that you've tried doing this, try to attempt both ways of approaching the drawing, both the kind of the hatching going one way and the hatching going the other, as you sort of work your way up the boot and you see that the plane changes are happening. The leather is going in, then it's coming out, and then it's going around, and there's a fold, and there's a bend, and there's a highlight, and then there's a bit going a different direction and a bit going a different direction. If you try doing a little hatching like that, that'll help out a lot. Now, if you're working on paper like the paper I have, which has a texture of its own, you'll find that in some cases, your hatching, because the value needs to be pretty light, is actually being kind of overrun by the texture of your paper. And don't worry if that happens. Just, go with the value. Don't worry so much about the direction. But when you do have an opportunity, it's, I think, really good practice to start working in how you hatch following a form. As you come back with the darker layers and adding in the darker stuff, some of that gets a little bit obliterated. But what you'll find out is that over time and across a large drawing, it will give your drawing more energy to have some sort of underlying movement going on. When you do the super academic drawing where you're trying to follow the plates and make them as smooth as you see on the plates, you don't have to worry about that stuff so much. You're on those exercises, you're trying for a particular finish that looks exactly like what's on the plate. And that's really good for kind of learning your pencil modulation. But as you start to draw things a bit more freely, draw things more free form, but using this kind of academic method, I think it is useful to try a little bit more of this business where you're actually kind of thinking about how does that tip of that pencil actually make the texture work, make the edge of something work. So as you draw along, and for example, say I had actually finished this boot, I would have gotten to a particular point where I would have had to make some decisions about, for example, the highlights on the upper part of the boot, the part that's actually dark leather, versus the lighter part of the bottom of the boot. And are both of those going to be paper color? Is one of those, maybe I'm going to actually try to come in with an H pencil using the same method and actually sort of fill in the darker upper of the boot, except for the brightest highlights, so that I have a little bit more differentiation. These types of problems will come up as you work across a drawing, in particular when you have one that has a number of values that are really close to each other. For example, the rim of this tractor that we see here in front of us and the boot. there are some similarities there in terms of value. And this is where you bring in the knowledge that you picked up through working with the beveled pencil, where really stroke direction had a lot to do with making one object look a little bit different from another. And also where sometimes you have to exaggerate something a little bit. So that means where the form turns at the back of the boot, when you get to the part of doing the rim around the edge of that rusted rim, that's when you start to notice the rim is actually catching a little bit of light, just a little bit of light running all the way down, all the way to the bottom through this reference picture. And maybe I want to accentuate that a little bit more and have it be a little bit maybe brighter or a little bit wider, so that there's a real difference there between what's going on the boot and what's going on the rim. Likewise, maybe as I'm actually, using this method, even though I'm using this academic method, which smooths things out, I still have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of texture on that rim. And when you do that, then of course you can have, the darker areas, the lighter areas, the, strokes going different directions, but trying to keep those in that sense very different, or the direction different from the ones that you did on the leather boot. So I think that when it comes to using this type of drawing, I tend to, on most drawings that I do these days, use a combination of so many different approaches. Sometimes I use the beveled pencil lead to get, large areas down. Sometimes I'll then come in with this more academic approach to the parts that I want to do in detail. I might finish up with my good old mechanical pencil just to pick out those highlights. I might use some smudging in some areas just to get a tonal quality, to things overall. And also, you can use this particular method, this sort of academic approach to how you're going to, using the site size method, working out your block in and your contours and then filling it in. You can do this on toned paper as well. And in fact, there's some gorgeous examples where people have very carefully done their drawing in graphite and then brought those highlights in on the toned paper with their white chalk or their white charcoal or whatever, and to a stunning effect, to make it, and it looks really wonderful. And so I think this is why I'm looking forward to, as we go along, I've got a couple more techniques to teach you before we really, try to mix them all up together. But I think it's good to have every single one of these skills in your toolbox, no matter which ones you prefer the most, because you never know when a particular part of a drawing is really better served. You might be doing something like a covered bridge, and you've got this roadway going underneath through the dark, through the shadow, and you've got trees and such around you. You've got all these various different foliage. You might have a small river. Each one of those could possibly be treated using a different type of pencil stroke. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes here to finish up. I'm getting a bit of lag here on my video for reasons I don't know why, so I'm going to see if there's something I can work out. Okay, everybody, this is when you toast the god of the cell tower and ask them to give me some more bars. And we'll see if we can get through the end of the class without it completely cutting out. Oh, the joys of living on Chappaquiddick. All right, I'm going to move on to the next step, even if we do have a little bit of lag there. And all I did really was I did not finish up the sketch completely, but whoops. But I did start adding in the darks. And so what you'll find as you go through this, you'll be working away, and just as I've mentioned numerous times before, you'll suddenly find you have lots and lots of midtones. Almost everything is a midtone. And at that point, you can either continue to work across the whole drawing and get all of those midtones sort of sorted out. But what I find at some point is I like to go back up to the upper left-hand corner and start again with adding in the darker area. It also gives me a chance to evaluate, do I need to redraw something? How accurate was I the first time around? And you'll find as you get used to doing this particular method and making things lighter or darker as you go, that this is actually, this part allows you to do a little bit kind of course correction as you go, maybe adding a bit more gesture into the shadows, maybe smoothing out some things that you saw before. But I think that you really do find that you have to do a number of passes on a drawing in order to be able to get the all the values, all the richness of what you see out. Now you could keep going and make your darkest areas even darker. What I find is, and if you look over on the right-hand side at the shadows from that rim on the tractor, I did that wash pretty evenly. I wasn't trying at all to do what I was doing on the boot, where I was changing the strokes and changing the direction. Instead, I wanted very much to have a very even wash of graphite. And I know that in subsequent passes, I will darken that up, but I'll be very careful to, unless I actually see an area that's darker, like there's a little bit of metal that comes in at the side, and where that goes up, it gets a little bit darker. Likewise, just under the turn of the rim, near the bottom of the reference, you can see there's sort of a darkness down there. You really want to be careful about overdoing the darkness on that early on in the image. And it's better to build up in layers and kind of reapproach something, using those midtones, and coming back in to the darkest areas and then having something to compare it against. So we're just going to go ahead and sort of wrap up wherever you are in this drawing, so that we can kind of do the final notes. But I will say that one thing you're probably seeing already as you go along is how much assessment you have to do when you're drawing this way as to whether what you're drawing is lighter than or darker than the area it's next to. And sometimes that means you have to actually go back and reevaluate a whole area that you drew to make it either lighter or darker in comparison. But this ability, especially to kind of do it on the fly as you're drawing, as you're moving around going, oh, I didn't really notice, but that's a little darker. Okay, that means that little area better be light before I move to the next darker area. As you move around the boot, for example, this ability to assess values like that will serve you really well, no matter whether you're drawing or painting. Often, particularly in painting, the color is not so important, but the value really is. And likewise in drawing, to be able to get our pencils to modulate, to be able to pull all of these values out, whether we're using the actual pencil itself or whether we're using in terms of the hardness or softness of the lead, or whether we're modulating it ourselves by holding the pencil further away from the lead, closer to the lead, et cetera, et cetera. It will allow you to get a lot more nuance out of your drawing. All right, let's wrap this up and go to the. Whoops! I just wanted to show you kind of all the steps here, just really quickly. The block in, which is the really rough kind of outline stage. The contour drawing, where you go back and you make everything much more accurate. Then as you start doing the inside drawing, you continue to refine. You can erase at any point and move things around. If a line is too dark or too light or in the wrong place, you can continue to use your eraser. And then you come back with another pass going for the darks, getting those in, making sure that the overall value that you see, the different value changes that you see in your reference, are properly reflected in your overall drawing. Okay, so just to wrap up, and I'm sorry that me speaking and the picture of me speaking are running at two completely different speeds for reasons unknown. But let's talk a little bit again, back to the concept. You can tell your own story, but you can also use imagery that speaks to your experience. So that wasn't my boot, and that wasn't my exact, the tractor that we used. But I feel that I can confidently draw a subject like that and talk about it as being part of my story, because I understand what's going on with it. And I think that just makes it easier to do a good drawing and something that has some personal meaning to you. You can be really literal in your interpretation, or you can suggest a story using a small portion of a scene or idea. So it literally would be fine to just do a drawing that wasn't that big reference material, but was the small bit, because that's a microcosm of the same story. We don't have to put in, if we want to do, for example, using the farm theme, right? We don't have to actually draw a farm. We can just draw that part of a boot on a tractor pedal, and that tells a story of a farm as well. So sometimes when you're thinking of a subject matter and it overwhelms you, that you want to draw something like your home or this, that, and the other, and it's just too much, how are you going to put everything in? Sometimes zooming way in to some small feature, for your home, for example, it could be just the doorknob for your front door, just something small like that. Or perhaps you have an ornament on the front step or something like that, and that tells something about the home. It's also an easier way to get into a drawing. And it's a really good way to also come up with subject matter for trying academic drawing and trying to go through these particular steps. So once again, just to review the technique for academic drawing, there's the sight size method, trying to draw things at the same size. And that's mostly to begin with, so that you can judge your own accuracy. It's so much easier to critique your own work when you see it right beside the thing that you're trying to duplicate. It's so much easier to see where things are going right or wrong. Then you do the block in, which is drawing in the overall shape of the forms without interior details, holding your pencil away from the lead so you can kind of get the gesture of what you're doing. The contour, where you refine those lines. And I also think it's really important to put those landmark or roadmap notes in there of where shadows appear. Where on a rounded form does the shadow stop and start? Getting that kind of accuracy sorted out up front before you start the inside drawing will just make your life so much easier, and the inside drawing part more fun. And if you are having trouble seeing where those shadow areas are, squint. And then drawing on the inside. Carefully drawing using hatching and a continuous motion, varying the pressure as needed, and constantly observing the subject matter. Now, what will happen initially is that everything will look too smoothed out until you get the hang of doing that hatching that goes sort of in the direction of following the form. That will, if you find your stuff looking too like the texture is the same overall, try doing that directional hatching as a way to sort of break yourself out of that. I think that will help quite a bit. And then also it can be useful to window shade rather than drawing all over the page at once. And that's in part so that you don't smudge what you've drawn. This technique relies a lot on the careful sort of application of graphite that really sits on the top of the ridges of your paper, rather than getting down into all the grooves of the paper. And so that makes it very easy to smudge. And I definitely find that the window shading, even if I have to do it 2 or 3 times with a piece of tracing paper, helps a bunch. Okay, so this was an introduction to how academic drawing works. And as we go forth this summer, I'm going to be suggesting areas in various different drawings and subjects that we do where one approach would be useful over another approach. So next week, we're going to go back to toned paper again. Since you've done that, we've done an exercise in that already, we'll be ready to jump right in and get to a more finished drawing in toned paper. And then after that, the following week, we'll come back to academic drawing again and pulling in some of the beveled pencil technique that we used before. I am determined that by the end of the summer, you're going to have a whole bevy of skills at your disposal. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen now. Okay, everybody. I think I'm not sure if I'm lining up a little bit more with my audio and visual now, so hopefully that's not too aggravating. Thank you so much for being here today and for working through this particular project with me. I'll send around a PDF with this reference material afterwards, and I hope you get a chance to experiment on it for yourself. Thanks so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the next episode of another Summer of Drawing.
Thank you. What a sense of humor. Oh my goodness.
All right, everybody.
Thanks Keep twirling, so everybody.
Keep
Bye-bye.
Draw on. Bye. Bye, Mom.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye. Thanks.